The attorney took his time looking up from the paper. I read it once, I read it twice, and somewhere between the second and third reading, I started to laugh. It wasn't the discreet laugh of someone trying to control themselves in a serious place. It was the laugh of someone carrying something very heavy for a long time and suddenly dropping it without warning. Attorney Hayes asked me very calmly if I was feeling well. I told him yes, that I was perfect, thank you. And it was true, it was the first time in many years I could say that without lying. But before explaining why I was laughing in an attorney's office on a Tuesday morning, I need to tell you where I come from. Because stories don't start where you think they start. They start much earlier, in places you didn't know how to read at the time. My name is Eleanor Miller. I'm 37 years old, I'm a CPA, and I was born in Oak Haven, Georgia, a county that smells like wet earth in May and wood smoke in November. The kind of place where last names are known before the people who carry them, where people greet each other by their grandfather's name before their own, where the facades of the houses keep up appearances with the exact same dedication that families use to keep their secrets. My dad, Arthur Miller, ran a hardware store in the center of town for 30 years. The kind of business that doesn't make anyone rich, but provides a dignified living if you take care of it. He was a man of few words, with broad hands, the kind who resolves things with silence rather than conversation. The townspeople respected him. He knew it, and he settled into that respect like someone sitting in the good living room chair. My mom, Connie, was the social heart of the family. The one who organized the holiday parties, the one who brought casseroles when someone got sick, the one who knew exactly who had married who and why it had lasted, or not. She had that ability of some women of her generation to make everything they did seem natural, as if keeping the world in order cost nothing at all. After me came my brother Ryan, 4 years younger, and from the moment I learned to add, I realized the numbers in that family didn't balance out evenly. I didn't understand it with adult words, of course. I understood it with kid logic, which is more honest, even if it lacks the technical terms. Ryan would be late for school, and my mom would call to excuse him. I was late once, and I was grounded for the weekend. Ryan broke something in the house, and the subject was changed before we even reached a scolding. I got straight A's in math, and the response was a passing very good, like someone commenting on the weather. It wasn't that they treated me badly. It was something harder to point out than abuse. It was a kind of invisibility, with room and board included. The kind of thing that hurts exactly because it isn't enough to be a clear offense. And so you grow up doubting if what you felt was real or just your own exaggeration. The only person in my family who made me feel like I truly existed was my paternal grandmother, Clara Miller, a small woman with white hair for as long as I could remember, with hands that smelled like rosemary because she always had some of those plants in the kitchen. She lived alone in a farmhouse on the outskirts of town, a property my grandfather had built, brick by brick, before dying young, leaving her 10 acres of land, the main house, a tin-roofed shed, and a fruit orchard that Grandma Clara maintained with a silent discipline I admired, without yet knowing that it was called admiration. Every Saturday morning I went to help her, not because I was asked. I just started showing up there on my own since I was 9, walking the 15 minutes that separated my parents' house from hers with my sneakers full of dust and my braids halfway done. Grandma Clara never asked why I came over. She just handed me one of the aprons hanging behind the kitchen door and put me to work, chopping whatever needed chopping or watering whatever needed watering. She was the first person who asked me what I wanted to study, not what I was going to study, like the others asked, assuming someone had already decided that for me, but what I wanted. I remember I stayed quiet for a moment because no one had ever asked me like that before. I told her I liked numbers, That in school, anything to do with math came easy to me. That sometimes I solved the problems before the teacher finished writing them on the board. She looked at me with those eyes of hers that judged absolutely nothing and told me that was a gift. That gifts aren't given, they are worked for. And that the day I wanted to leave to study away from home, I shouldn't ask anyone for permission. I should just go. I was 10 years old when she told me that. I didn't fully understand it, but it stayed locked away inside me. I got into the university in Atlanta with a partial scholarship that I supplemented by working at a campus bookstore. I didn't ask my parents for money, not because they couldn't have afforded it, but because I had already learned that asking for something in that house opened the possibility of them saying no in a way that left you feeling guilty for having needed anything at all. I left with a backpack, a borrowed mattress, and the certainty that it was easier to build from scratch than to wait for someone to hand you the materials. Grandma Clara called me on Sunday nights, a short 10-minute call without much to say. "How was your week?" "Good, Grandma." "Are you eating?" "Yes." "Did you thank God today?" "Yes." "Well, take care." When we hung up, I would sit for a moment with the phone in my hand, feeling that feeling you get when someone reminds you that you exist. I finished my degree in 5 years. I got my license. I stayed in Atlanta. I found a job at a mid-sized accounting firm, learned fast. I moved up slowly but without stopping. It wasn't a movie career. It was a real person's career, waking up early and doing a good job every single day. My parents, when they found out I had my own office, asked if it wasn't too much of an expense to rent a place when I could just work from home. I smiled. I didn't answer. I met Eric at a condo board meeting in the building where I rented. He lived on the floor above. He was a middle school teacher, read a lot, cooked well, and had the rare ability to listen without simultaneously thinking about what he was going to say next. We got married 4 years later, in a small ceremony without any big fuss, at the Atlanta courthouse, followed by lunch in the garden at his mother's house. My parents came, they put on a good face. My mom asked Eric what school he taught at, with that tone that already had the answer baked in, measuring if the response was respectable enough. Eric answered kindly. Later, he told me, on the way home, that my mom was very good at asking questions that were actually evaluations. I agreed with him without saying anything else. Grandma Clara couldn't come to the wedding because her knees weren't doing well anymore. I sent her a picture through a text from her neighbor's phone, who was the one managing those things for her. The reply came the next day. It was a heart and a short message that said, "It is about time, my girl. Take good care of each other." I saved it in a screenshot folder that I still have today. The first serious problem with my family arrived 3 years after the wedding, when Ryan, who by then had already tried his luck with 2 failed businesses, quietly funded by my parents, called to ask me to look over his books. I did. I told him what I saw. Unsafe expenses inflated income in his projections, debts that were already past due with suppliers. I gave him an honest diagnosis from an accountant, not from a sister trying to look good. Ryan got upset. He said I didn't understand the vision of the business, that numbers didn't tell the whole story. I told him that is exactly what numbers are for, to tell the story the vision refuses to see. That conversation reached my dad's ears, not the way I delivered it, but the way Ryan told it. That I had been cruel, that I had discouraged him, that instead of supporting my brother, I had preferred to show off my degrees. My mom called me the next day, with that tone of hers, the tone of someone who doesn't accuse directly, but builds the case while talking. That Ryan was very hurt, that I had always been very harsh, that the family needed unity and not criticism. I hung up the phone and sat in my kitchen for a long time. I told Eric what had happened. He listened to me without interrupting and then said something that kept spinning in my head. That in some families, loyalty means keeping the truth from the person who needs to hear it the most. And that wasn't a loyalty worth buying at the price they were charging me. Grandma Claire's health started to decline that same year. 81 years old, diabetes that went way back, and a heart asking for rest. I went to see her when I could, one weekend a month if work allowed it. Eric almost always came with me. We helped her with whatever needed doing around the house. We brought her groceries. We sat with her on the porch in the afternoon drinking percolator coffee in those thick ceramic mugs she made herself when she was young, which she still kept with a care that inspired more tenderness than anything else. On one of those visits, about 8 months before she died, Grandma Clara told me something I didn't quite know how to process at the time. We were alone in the kitchen. She was peeling apples with that slow precision of someone who has done the same thing 1,000 times. And she told me she had already arranged everything that needed arranging. Not to worry, that when the time came, I would understand. I asked her what she meant. She answered that the land and the house already had an owner, and that owner was me. That she had registered it properly under God and the law with an attorney in Macon because she didn't want any misunderstandings later. That she knew her son and knew how he thought when there were assets involved. I stood there with the spoon in my hand, not knowing what to say. I told her it wasn't necessary, that I loved her, not what she owned. She told me she already knew that, and that was exactly why she had done it. Because the things you leave to the people you truly love, you have to nail them down tight, so nobody can take them away later. Then she changed the subject and asked if I wanted cinnamon in the pie or no cinnamon. We never talked about it again. I filed it away somewhere in my head, the way you file things you don't yet know are real, or if you just misunderstood them. And I went on with my life. Grandma Clara died in February, early on a Friday morning, with her neighbor Hope on one side and me on the other, holding her hand, while her breathing spaced out further and further until it stopped completely. It was the first time I was present when someone left. I didn't know the silence that remains afterward sounds different from any other silence. The wake was at her house, just as she had asked. The townspeople filled the porch. People I didn't know came up and told me beautiful things about her. Things that confirmed the woman I had known since I was a child was the exact same one everyone else had known too. Just one version. That is rare, and it is worth a lot. My parents arrived that same afternoon. My dad looked older than I remembered. My mom wore the composure of someone who had practiced her solemn face before leaving the house. Ryan arrived late the next day with an explanation nobody asked for about why he couldn't get there sooner. I greeted him. We hugged with the awkwardness of hugging acquaintances who are no longer close. What came after the burial was what always comes in these situations: the estate. My dad took the reins with the natural ease of someone assuming his role. He started talking about the property as if it were a matter already settled between him and Ryan, commenting on the possibility of selling to a buyer who had already tested the waters with a price that, according to him, was good for what it was. He informed me he didn't ask me. He informed me. I didn't say anything at that moment. I was grieving. And grief has its own weight pushing down on you that doesn't let you think clearly. Besides, somewhere in my head, I still hadn't fully believed what Grandma Clara had told me in the kitchen that afternoon with the apples. I went back to Atlanta with Eric. The weeks dragged on. The firm, the clients, the weekends, the daily life that keeps moving even when you don't feel like moving with it. And at some point between the first and second month after the funeral, the first call from my mom came, asking when I was going to go to town to sign some papers for my grandmother's property. I told her I was busy, that I would let her know. Another week passed, she called again. Then my dad called, which he almost never did, and that right there was a sign this thing had more urgency than they were letting on. I told him the same thing, that I was reviewing some pending matters before signing anything. My dad said there was nothing to review, that it was routine paperwork, that the longer it took, the more complicated the process got. That is when I started to feel that tingling in my stomach I get when the numbers don't add up. Because routine paperwork doesn't generate urgency. And the urgency was telling me there was something I didn't know. I pulled the property deed history from the county clerk's online records in Macon, right from my computer. One night, when Eric was already asleep, and I was still up with a cold coffee in my hand and a head that wouldn't shut up. It took me about 20 minutes to navigate the system, because those government sites never work the way they should. But when I found what I was looking for, I just stared at the screen, without moving, for a long time. There it was, a registered deed of gift, filed and dated 4 years ago, before Grandma Clara got sick, before I even knew she was thinking about it. 2/3 of the property, the house and the orchard, transferred into the name of Eleanor Miller. The remaining third corresponded to the share that had rightfully gone to my dad as an only child when my grandfather died, which had been registered in his name for years. I read it 3 times. Then I closed the laptop, went to the kitchen, poured myself a glass of water, and drank it standing in front of the sink, staring out the dark patio window. There was nothing to see outside, but I looked anyway. What Grandma Clara had told me that afternoon in her kitchen wasn't a possibility or an intention. It was a done deal. Notarized, filed with the county, the whole 9 yards. She hadn't told me as a heads up. She had told me as a confirmation of something already set in stone long before, locked in the public records of Macon County, waiting for the moment I would need to know it. And I was needing to know it right at that exact moment, because my dad had been pressuring me for weeks to sign something whose exact nature he had never clearly explained. And now I understood why the explanation wasn't coming, because the explanation would have revealed what I had just found on my own. I went back to bed. I didn't sleep well that night. The next morning, I told Eric what I had found. He listened with that teacher's attention of his, used to hearing important things without interrupting. When I finished, he stayed quiet for a moment. He finished his coffee and said, "You need to talk to an estate attorney before you take another step. Not with your dad, with a lawyer." So I did. I called a fellow CPA who works with a law firm in Atlanta and gave her the broad strokes. She recommended Mr. Sterling, an attorney who had been in the business for 20 years, and who, according to her, was the kind who tells it like it is, even if it is not what you want to hear. I made an appointment for that same week. Mr. Sterling was a middle-aged man, dark-rimmed glasses, a desk with papers organized with a precision that gave me immediate confidence. I showed him the printout of the deed history and explained the situation. He asked me 3 short, precise questions, reviewed the document, calmly, flipped it over, looked something up in his system, and then told me exactly what I had suspected, but needed to hear from someone who knew what they were talking about. The transfer was completely valid, recorded before the donor's passing, legally ratified with the corresponding signatures. 2/3 of that property had been mine for 4 years. It hadn't entered probate because, legally, it couldn't. The transfer had occurred when Grandma Clara was still alive and had full legal capacity. If someone was planning a sale of that property without my consent, Mr. Sterling told me, with the calm of a doctor delivering a diagnosis, That sale had a very serious problem. I walked out of the office with the deed printout in my purse and a weird feeling that took me a while to identify. It wasn't exactly relief. It was more like that clarity that hits you when you finally understand the instructions for something you'd been reading wrong from the start. That night, I called my mom. I told her that before signing anything, I needed them to explain exactly what they were selling and under what conditions. There was a silence on the other end of the line that lasted just long enough to confirm my question had caught them off guard. My mom said my dad could explain that better, that she didn't get involved in those matters. I told her, fine, have my dad call me. My dad called the next day. He used his usual tone, the tone of someone who has already decided what's going to happen and is just waiting for everyone else to catch up. He explained there was a buyer interested in my grandmother's property, a guy from Macon who owned a nursery and wanted to expand, that the price was fair, that the land had been sitting for years producing nothing because Grandma Clara couldn't handle it anymore, and that the smartest move was to sell it before it deteriorated further. I asked him why they needed my signature if the property belonged to my grandmother and the probate court should handle it. There was another pause. Then he told me there were some title details that required my participation as a direct relative, that it was just paperwork. That same word, paperwork. I told him I had checked the county records, and I wanted to better understand those details before signing a single thing. His tone changed. Not a lot, but enough for me to notice. He said there was nothing to understand, that it was a formality, that I had always made simple things very complicated. I was expecting that last line. It was the line that came out every time I asked a question they didn't want to answer. That I was complicated, that I exaggerated, that I was looking for problems where there were none. I told him to give me a few days to review it. I hung up. What followed in the coming weeks was a slow escalation that I documented without meaning to, just saving the text messages and noting the dates of the calls in my planner, the way I do with everything. My mom called every third day with a variation on the same theme, that the buyer wasn't going to wait forever, that they needed the money, that Ryan was in a tough spot and the sale could help stabilize him. They didn't drop that last part on me until the fifth or sixth try, when they saw the other justifications weren't moving me. That Ryan needed the money. There was the real reason buried under all the others. Ryan was in debt again, this time with a construction supply vendor he had bought materials from for a bid he ended up losing. My dad had co-signed. Grandma Clara's property was the solution. What neither of them knew yet was that 2/3 of that solution belonged to me. The breaking point came on a Sunday, not at a family dinner or a planned meeting, but in a call that started like the others and ended up being different. My dad called at noon, with Ryan listening in the background, which I could guess by certain silences that felt occupied. He told me they needed an answer that week, that they couldn't wait any longer, that he had given his word to the buyer and his word meant something. I told him I understood his word meant something, and that was exactly why I wanted us to fully understand what I was signing, because my name meant something too, and I wasn't putting it on any piece of paper without knowing exactly what that paper said. My dad raised his voice. He didn't yell. He was a man who didn't yell. But he raised his voice in that way that carries more weight than a shout, because it comes backed by years of unquestioned authority. He told me I had become very different since I left Oak Haven, that the city environment and the husband I had chosen had changed me for the worse, that I didn't used to be like this. I asked him how I used to be. He told me I was more obedient. Eric was in the living room when I hung up the phone. He didn't need to ask me anything. He sat me down next to him on the couch, put his arm around my shoulders, and stayed like that quiet, while I stared at the floor and let everything that had just happened settle into its place. That night, I decided I wasn't going to sign. Not yet. Not without understanding absolutely everything. And if that decision made them angry, I was going to have to live with that anger. What I didn't calculate was the speed at which that turned into something else. My mom stopped calling cold turkey. Ryan sent me a single text message that just said, "Now I see how you are." I didn't reply. My dad never dialed my number again. The silence that arrived was different from the silence before. It wasn't the natural distance of people living in different cities with busy lives. It was a constructed, deliberate silence with sharp edges. I found out through my cousin Lucy, my mom's sister's daughter, that the story circulating in Oakhaven was that I had refused to help the family in a time of need, that I had turned against my parents, that Eric had me totally controlled and isolated from my people. Lucy told me with the discomfort of someone who knows they are delivering bad news, but also feels the person has a right to know. I thanked her. I told her that what she just told me was the reason a girl sometimes decides to leave, so she doesn't have to keep watching them paint her in colors she never wore. Months passed. 6-8 a year. Eric and I kept on with our lives in Atlanta. The firm grew. We brought on a young junior accountant who learned fast and reminded me of myself 10 years ago. We slept well. We cooked together on Sundays. We went to the movies when something caught our eye. It was a quiet life, the kind that, from the outside, might look devoid of drama, but on the inside, feels like the home you always imagined having. What wasn't quiet was the background noise. That story about me still running through the hometown which I knew existed even if I didn't hear it directly. Lucy updated me every so often, always with her careful tone, that my mom had told a friend from church I was going through a tough time emotionally, that my dad had commented at a town council meeting that his daughter had made choices she was probably going to regret, that Ryan was posting things online about the importance of family without naming me, but with timing that left little to the imagination. It was the same old machine, just operating now without my presence to contradict it. A year and a half after the last time I spoke to my parents, Grandma Clara showed up in my dreams 2 nights in a row. Nothing special happened in those dreams. We were just in her kitchen, she was peeling fruit, I was sitting in the wicker chair that was always in the corner, and there was an afternoon light coming through the window in a very specific way. I'm not someone who puts a lot of weight on dreams, but it left me with a feeling I couldn't shake all day. On the 3rd day, the envelope arrived. It was a white, legal-sized envelope with the letterhead of a law firm in Macon. Notary Public Number 14, Hayes and Associates. My name printed in a typewriter font that looked formal and cold at the same time. I got it in the morning when I went down to check the mail. I stared at it for a moment in the lobby of the building and took it up to the apartment without opening it. I put it on the dining table. I made coffee. I sat across from it as if it were a wild animal I shouldn't startle. Eric left for work before I opened it. He kissed my forehead goodbye and asked if I was okay. I told him yes, just some office stuff to sort out. See you tonight. He looked at me a second longer than necessary in that way of his that means he knows something is up, but he's going to respect my timeline to process it. Then he grabbed his bag and left. I was left alone with the white envelope and the coffee. I opened it when the coffee was almost cold. It was a 2-page letter, drafted in that legal jargon that mixes formality with impersonality, in a way that makes everything sound neutral, even when it isn't. Attorney Hayes was informing me that within the framework of the regularization and sale process of the property located in Oakhaven, Georgia, known as the Hopewell Farm, registered in the public records under the cited folio, The presence or power of attorney of all registered owners was required to proceed with the deed of sale. Since my name appeared on the deed as the title holder of a fraction of the property they were requesting, I present myself at their offices within a period no longer than 20 business days to sign the corresponding transfer of rights, or, failing that, to contact the number at the bottom of the letter to arrange the necessary logistics. There was a second, shorter paragraph stating that in the event of receiving no response within the indicated time frame, they would proceed to explore the corresponding legal avenues to resolve the situation. I read the whole thing, folded it, unfolded it, and read it again. A year and a half without a phone call, without a birthday text, without a single sign that I still existed in my family's plans. And the first time my name appeared again was on a legal document, asking me to sign away the rights to the only thing Grandma Clara had left me. I sat in that chair for a long time. The coffee was completely cold now. Outside, you could hear the normal street noise. A truck driving by, someone blasting music in their car, the world spinning on like nothing happened. And then I thought of Grandma Clara, of what she had told me that afternoon, that she knew her son and knew exactly what was going to happen, and that is why she had done everything she did, with patience, with clarity. 4 years before the story reached this point, she had left me more than a piece of property. She had left me prepared. I stood up from the chair, washed the mug, grabbed my phone, and called Mr. Sterling. Mr. Sterling saw me that very afternoon. I explained the situation with every detail, from my dad's phone call to the envelope I had just received. He listened without interrupting, taking notes on a legal pad with his habit of writing down the important things by hand. When I finished talking, he leaned back in his chair and told me something I already knew, but needed to hear spoken by someone who understood the full legal implications. What they were trying to do was impossible without my signature. Period. 2/3 of that property had been registered in my name for 4 years. There was no legal path to sell it, transfer it, or put a lien on it without me appearing voluntarily and with full knowledge of what I was signing. The 20-day deadline and the mention of legal avenues at the end of the letter were, in his words, pressure tactics, not real procedure, because there was no real procedure possible that didn't go through me. He asked me what I wanted to do. I told him I wanted to go, that I wanted to sit in that law office and watch my dad's face when he realized what Grandma Clara had done. Mr. Sterling nodded with the seriousness of someone who doesn't judge his client's motivations, but makes damn sure they walk in fully prepared. He told me to go with a certified copy of the property deed, that he would get it for me that week, and that if my dad or his lawyer tried to question the validity of the gift, the recorded filing predating her passing was the ultimate trump card that killed any argument. I left his office with an appointment to pick up the documents on Thursday of that same week. The days between that meeting and Thursday were weird. Not anxious exactly, but filled with that hyper-focus you get when you know something big is coming and your brain starts prepping on its own, even without you giving it instructions. I slept fine, worked normally, but there was a part of me rehearsing in silence, reviewing the documents mentally, anticipating my dad's words with the exact precision of someone who has known him her entire life. I told Eric what I had decided. He listened closely, asked a couple of questions about the paperwork, and then asked if I wanted him to go with me. I told him no, that this was something I needed to do alone, that if there was anyone else present, my dad could use as a distraction or a scapegoat, he would use them. Eric didn't push it. He just told me he'd have the coffee ready when I got back, and that if I needed to talk halfway there, to call without a second thought. On Thursday, I picked up the documents. a certified copy of the deed with the county seal, the record of the gift with the date and deed number, and an extra sheet Mr. Sterling had drawn up summarizing the legal implications in plain English, just in case they needed spelling out in the room. I put them in a navy blue cardboard folder I use for important files, the same one I take to client meetings when the matter requires strict rigor. That night, I called my cousin Lucy. I asked her if she knew anything else about what was going on with the property. Lucy took a second to answer, measuring her words like she always did. Then she told me she'd heard from her mom that my dad was in a rush because the buyer, the nursery guy, had given an informal advance. Not notarized, no contract, just a cash advance sealed with a handshake, which was the way my dad had done business his whole life, because in his world, a man's word was enough collateral. The problem with those kinds of guarantees is they don't account for reality not cooperating. Lucy also told me, lowering her voice, that Ryan owed money to 2 other people besides the supply vendor, that the situation was worse than the family was letting on publicly, that my dad had leveraged not only Grandma Clara's property, but also a chunk of his personal savings to back Ryan's business, and that if the farm sale didn't close soon, the fallout was going to be highly visible and impossible to hide in a town that small. I hung up with Lucy and stood for a moment with the phone in my hand, staring at the wall. I didn't feel what maybe I should have felt. I didn't feel satisfaction or relief or anything resembling movie revenge. I felt something closer to sadness. The heavy, drama-free kind. Because my dad was a 70-year-old man who had bet his life savings on a son's business, when that son had never managed to learn that businesses don't run on good intentions. And my mom was a woman who had built her entire life around a version of the family that turned out to be much more fragile than it looked from the outside. And Ryan was my brother, even if I forgot it sometimes. And the deaths of adults who refuse to grow up end up crushing everyone standing nearby. But it was also true that none of them had called me in a year and a half to ask how I was doing. That the only time my name had factored into their plans was when they needed something from me. And that the woman who had truly loved me unconditionally and without an agenda was the one buried in the Oak Haven Cemetery for 2 years now. Grandma Clara knew all of that, and she knew it long before I ever did. The following Monday, I drove down to Oak Haven. It's a 3-hour drive from Atlanta on the state highway, a route I know by heart because I did it so many times as a kid and a teenager, and the body remembers it, even if the eyes aren't paying attention. I passed the same old billboards, the same curves before the county line, the same smell of dry earth that shifts as you get closer to downtown, mixing with the diners and the stalls on the square. I arrived 40 minutes before the appointment. I parked a block away from the law office and sat in the car with the engine off. I wasn't nervous in the way you get nervous before a fight. I was dialed in, which is different. It was the same intense focus I get before presenting a brutal audit or sitting down with a client who refuses to hear what the numbers are screaming. I checked the documents one more time in the car. Everything was in order. I closed the folder. I walked into the law office 5 minutes early. It was a ground floor space on Main Street with a young receptionist who greeted me with a professional smile and asked for my name. When I gave it to her, I saw her look something up on her screen, her expression staying neutral for a second before shifting into something slightly more guarded. They had told her something about me. I didn't know what, but enough for her to change her tone. She led me to a small waiting area with 2 brown leather chairs and a side table with magazines nobody had flipped through in a long time. The walls had framed diplomas and a color reproduction of an antique map of Georgia. I sat down, placed the folder on my knees. 5 minutes later, my dad walked in. Arthur Miller walked slower than the last time I had seen him. He was wearing the clothes he saved for important meetings, a dress shirt, slacks, polished shoes. His hair had grayed out more than I remembered. He looked exactly like what he was, an older man carrying something heavy who had learned to hide it well, but not flawlessly. He saw me from the door. There was a moment of something I couldn't quite name, a fraction of a second where his face was just his face, before he strapped on the expression he had rehearsed for this meeting. He walked over, greeted me with a bizarre formality, like someone greeting an acquaintance in a context where they weren't supposed to know each other. I said good morning. I sat back down. Ryan didn't show up. I half expected that. Ryan was never present for the fallout of the things he set in motion. Attorney Hayes called us in a few minutes later. He was a guy in his late 50s, salt and pepper hair, navy suit, carrying that inherent calm of lawyers who have seen enough families in this exact situation to never be surprised by anything. He pointed to the chairs across from his desk. We sat. On the desk lay an open file with the sale documents, the contract with the buyer, the property description, and a transfer of rights deed with my name printed right under a blank line. My dad started talking before Attorney Hayes even finished sitting down. He talked about the farm with the detachment of someone listing an asset on an inventory sheet. Square footage, years without active production, maintenance costs nobody was covering. He talked about the buyer as if it were a done deal that just needed my ink to make it official. He used the word family like a rhetorical weapon, not to describe something real. I listened to everything without interrupting. When he finished, Attorney Hayes looked at me and asked if I had any questions before we proceeded with reviewing the documents. I told him yes. I had one observation before we did anything else. I opened my folder, pulled out the certified copy of the property deed, and I placed it on the desk with the county seal facing up, sliding it toward the center of the table, with the exact same calm you use to lay down a card in a game where you already know you hold the winning hand. This, I said, is the official deed history of the property, recorded in the county clerk's office in Macon. As you can see in the filing on page 2, there is a deed of gift, registered 4 years ago, ratified by a notary public, through which my grandmother, Clara Miller, transferred 2/3 of the property to me prior to her passing. The transfer predates probate, which means that fraction of the estate never entered the inheritance pool. Attorney Hayes grabbed the document instantly. He read it with the sharp focus of someone who knows exactly what he's looking for. He took off his glasses, blinked once, put them back on, and read the filing again. My dad didn't touch the paper. He just stared at it from his side of the desk with an expression I had known for a very long time. It was the face he made when something didn't go as calculated and his brain was redlining, trying to find an alternate route. Attorney Hayes looked up and looked at him first. Then he looked at me, and with the flawless neutrality of someone trained to never show shock in rooms like this, he said he was going to need a moment to review the documentation in detail before continuing with the procedure. It was in that moment, in that silence following his words, that I started to laugh. I didn't plan it. It wasn't a theatrical stunt or an act of cruelty. It was a laugh pulled from a place I didn't even know was holding that much air. From all the years of being the complicated one, the difficult one, the one who exaggerated, the one who had changed, the one who needed psychiatric help according to the narrative my dad had peddled to half the town. And suddenly, all of it was resolved by a county filing dated 4 years ago. Resolved by a tiny woman with hands that smelled of rosemary, who had seen exactly what was going to happen before it happened, and had decided to do something about it, quietly and patiently. Attorney Hayes asked me very calmly if I was feeling well. I told him, yes, that I was perfect, thank you. And it was true. My dad said that was impossible, that his mother would never have done that without telling him, that there had to be a mistake on the document or at the clerk's office. Attorney Hayes answered him with the technical precision of a man who can't afford to be sloppy in his line of work. That the filing predated the death, and if the title history reflected that gift, the correct protocol was to verify it with the Macon County clerk before moving forward with any paperwork, which he would do himself through the proper channels. My dad looked at me, not with anger, but with something much harder to sustain than anger. Something that, in another context, in another story, might have been called bewilderment, or maybe the dawn of an understanding he wasn't quite ready to fully grasp. He asked me if I had known the whole time. I told him the truth, that no. That Grandma Clara had mentioned it to me one afternoon in her kitchen, without giving details, that I had filed it away without fully believing it, and that I hadn't confirmed a single thing until I got his lawyer's letter and went to check the public records myself. I told him if anyone had planned anything, it was her. I just showed up prepared. Attorney Hayes asked us to give him a moment to make a call to the county clerk in Macon. He told us we could wait in the conference room or the lobby while he verified it. My dad said he was staying put. I did too. We were left entirely alone in that office, with the desk between us, and the silence doing the heavy lifting neither of us was ready to do with words. My dad had his hands resting on the table, the same broad hardware store hands I remembered from childhood, the ones that had hauled cement bags and screwed in hinges and signed invoices for 30 years. Now they were perfectly still, which gave them a different kind of weight, like tools without a job to do. He asked me why I hadn't said anything earlier when I called to tell him I was going to check the papers before signing. Why hadn't I told him then? What I knew, I told him that at that moment, I didn't know anything for sure. That I went digging exactly because the math wasn't mathing, and I wanted to figure out why. That if I had come to him with what I suspected without proving it first, he would have told me I was wrong and exaggerating, like always. He didn't answer that because it was true. And we both knew it. Then he told me, without taking his eyes off the desk, that Ryan's debts were serious. That it wasn't just talk, they were real debts with real people, and time was running out. That he had bet everything he had because it was his son, and he couldn't have done anything else. I listened to that carefully, not because it changed anything about my decision, but because it was the first time in a very long time my dad had spoken to me without the tone of a man controlling the room. It was a different tone, narrower, sounding more like an actual human being than the character he had built for the world to see. I told him I heard him, that I understood he was in a tight spot, but that the property Grandma Clara left me was the only thing she had left me, and she had done it with a clear purpose that I was obligated to respect. My dad looked up. He told me his mother had always loved me more. He said it without bitterness, more like an observation, like someone finally naming a thing they had always known but never said out loud. I told him Grandma Clara had loved me in a way I desperately needed and hadn't found anywhere else. That it wasn't an indictment of anyone, it was just what happened. Silence again. Attorney Hayes came back 15 minutes later, walked in with his notepad, sat down, adjusted his glasses, and confirmed what we already knew. The county clerk in Macon had the deed of gift recorded with the corresponding date and instrument number. 2/3 of the property had been legally in my name for 4 years. The sale process as drafted could not move forward without my active participation and explicit consent. My dad asked if there was any way to contest the gift. Attorney Hayes explained with the same unflappable calm that a living gift ratified by a notary and recorded in the public registry, executed by an adult of sound mind, had 0 legal grounds to be challenged by a third party, including direct family members, unless they could prove coercion, fraud, or mental incapacity at the time of signing. And given that the deed was 4 years old and processed by a notary who certified the donor's full capacity, that route was essentially a dead end. My dad took all that in with the face of a man getting a diagnosis he didn't want, but deep down already knew was coming. I asked Attorney Hayes what happened to the cash advance the buyer had already paid. He looked at me for a second before answering, weighing the question. Then he said that if an advance had been made without a formal contract or deed, that was strictly an issue between my dad and the buyer, which would have to be settled completely independent of the property's status, since legally there was no binding commitment attached to the 2/3 that belonged to me. My dad closed his eyes for a second, just 1 second. Then he opened them and went back to being the man with the rigid posture he had always been, even if holding that posture cost him a hell of a lot more now. I told Attorney Hayes I wasn't signing any transfer of rights that day, that the property was mine by the express will of my grandmother, and I was going to honor that will. That if I ever decided to do something with that land, it would be my own decision on my own timeline. Attorney Hayes nodded, jotted something down on his legal pad, and said it was on the record. He gathered the papers carefully, slipped them back into the file, and officially concluded the meeting. We all stood up. There was a moment in the hallway where my dad and I ended up face to face before reaching the door. Nobody else was close by. The receptionist was on the phone staring at her monitor. My dad told me quietly that he was going to say something, and he didn't want me to take it as an attack. I told him I was listening. He told me he had always believed he was doing the right thing, that he wasn't a bad man, that the choices he made with Ryan came from a place he didn't know how to explain properly, but had to do with the kind of father he wanted to be, and probably hadn't known how to be. I stayed quiet for a moment. I told him I believed him, that I didn't doubt he thought he was doing the right thing, but intentions and consequences are two very different animals, and that I had grown up carrying the consequences of choices made with great intentions, but without ever factoring me in. He took that. He didn't fight it. I walked out of the law office. Main Street was buzzing with the usual Monday noon traffic. People on the sidewalks, a hot dog stand on the corner, the smell of barbecue drifting from a joint nearby. I stopped for a second on the curb with my car keys in my hand. I didn't feel victorious. I already knew this beforehand, but I confirmed it right there. This wasn't a victory. It was a resolution, and those are two different things. A victory implies someone won and someone lost. A resolution is when things finally settle into the exact place they were supposed to be all along. I walked to my car, got in, tossed the folder on the passenger seat, and started the engine. Before leaving town, I decided to swing by the property. I hadn't planned on it. It wasn't on the itinerary, but the car just pulled in that direction, and I let it. The Hopewell farm was 10 minutes from downtown, down a dirt road that started right past the creek bridge. I had driven it hundreds of times as a kid with Grandma Clara, when she still drove her own car. A beige '94 sedan she kept spotless until her knees told her it was over. I had driven it as an adult, too, on my weekend visits, but this time was different, because this time, I was pulling up as the owner of 2/3 of what sat at the end of that road, and that gave every curve a weight it didn't have before. The wooden gate was locked with a chain and padlock, the same faded green gate that had been there since I was a child. I got out of the car, pulled out the keyring Grandma Clara had given me years ago when I started going alone to take care of her, and found the key among the rest. I popped the lock. The property smelled of dry earth and tall, uncut grass. The main house had its windows shut tight, the paint on the siding chipping at the corners, but the bones were solid. The tool shed was still standing in its place at the back of the yard. The fruit orchard was neglected, but breathing. The trees had branches begging for a trim, but they still held leaves, holding their ground, the way well-rooted things do, even when nobody is paying them any attention. I walked slowly across the yard, stepping through the tall grass that soaked my sneakers. I walked past the porch where the wicker chairs sat, where Grandma Clara and I used to drink percolator coffee in the afternoons. I walked past the kitchen, peered through the window glass into the dark interior, where the wooden table sat with the blue floral oilcloth she never swapped out, because she said blue flowers brought peace. At the back of the yard, next to the shed, stood the lemon tree Grandma Clara had planted the year my dad was born. It had the thick, twisted trunk of an old tree and branches that shot out in every direction without asking anyone for permission. It still had lemons on it. Not a lot, but they were there, green and round, hiding in the leaves. I stood under that tree for a minute. I didn't cry. Not exactly. My eyes just welled up the way they do when something hits you all at once. Not out of sadness, but out of recognition. Like when you finally see something you already knew but hadn't fully looked at. Grandma Clara had planted that tree the year her son was born. The son who grew up and couldn't see me. And she had left me the dirt where that tree just kept bearing fruit. I don't know if she engineered it that way. Probably not, but that was the image I had right then. And it stuck with me. I left the farm an hour later. I closed the gate, snapped the padlock, pocketed the key. On my way back to the highway, I passed the general store where Grandma Clara used to buy the coarse coffee beans she loved so much. I pulled over, walked in, and bought a bag of the exact same kind, the usual. The one with the label saying it was locally roasted. The one she swore was the only thing that actually tasted like real coffee. The woman at the register recognized me. She asked if I was Clara's granddaughter. I said yes. She told me she was a very good woman, that the town missed her. I thanked her, my voice a little tighter than normal. I drove back to Atlanta with the coffee on the passenger seat next to the navy blue folder, my brain processing everything with that slow churn reserved for things that are just too massive to swallow in one bite. Eric was home when I got back. The coffee he promised was sitting hot in the pot, which meant he'd been watching the clock without saying a word. I told him everything while we both drank coffee sitting at the kitchen table. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he asked me how I was doing. I told him I was fine, that I was exhausted, but fine, that it felt different. He told me, yeah, it is different. What happened in the following days was messier than I expected, not because of the legal red tape, but because of the fallout around it. My mom called 2 days later. Her voice had lost the rehearsed polish of her previous calls. It sounded raw, rough, entirely unscripted. She told me what I had done was cruel, that I had left my family in a terrible situation, that she didn't deserve this, after everything she had sacrificed. I let her talk. I didn't interrupt her. When she ran out of breath, I told her calmly that I hadn't done a single thing, that Grandma Clara had made a legal decision 4 years before she died, and I had simply walked into the lawyer's office with the piece of paper proving it. That if there was a terrible situation, that situation existed long before I walked into that conference room, and I wasn't the architect of it. My mom said I always had an answer for everything, that it was real easy to hide behind technicalities when it came to your own flesh and blood. I told her they weren't technicalities. They were the papers my grandmother signed with her own hand and her own free will, because she knew her family better than anyone. My mom hung up. Ryan texted me that same night. It was a long block of text, longer than anything Ryan had written to me in years. Packed with words, swinging wildly from resentment to something attempting to be an explanation without ever quite getting there. He told me he never wanted to screw me over, that his businesses had just been bad luck, that I couldn't possibly understand the pressure he was under because I had always had it so much easier. I read the whole thing, saved it. I didn't reply that night. The next day I read it again. That part about me having it so much easier kept bouncing around in my skull. Not because it hurt, but because it felt like a revelation. Ryan genuinely believed that. In his version of reality, I had been handed more opportunities, more support, an easier ride. And from inside that delusion, what I did at the lawyer's office must have looked exactly like he said it did. A ruthless move by a sister who always had the upper hand. I didn't reply that day either. My cousin Lucy called me on the third day. She told me the nursery guy, the buyer, had gone to talk to my dad at his house, and the conversation had gotten ugly. That the cash advance my dad took had to be returned, and my dad didn't have the liquidity because he'd already burned it covering a chunk of Ryan's debts. That a deadline was set for repayment, and it was a tight one. Lucy wasn't telling me this so I would swoop in and fix it. She was telling me because she felt I needed to know the truth of the blast radius. I thanked her. I told her I still didn't know what I was going to do with the farm long term, that I needed time to think about it. But the one thing I knew for a fact was that I wasn't making a single decision under duress. That same week, I went to see Mr. Sterling again. Not because I needed urgent counsel, but because I needed to think out loud with someone who grasped the mechanics of it without having any emotional skin in the game. I laid out exactly where the board stood after the showdown at the office. I asked him what my options were with the property. He walked me through a few. I could leave it exactly as it was and slowly manage it. I could rent it out. I could try to strike a deal with my dad for his third if he and I ever wanted to do something jointly with the whole plot. Or I could just do absolutely nothing for now and let time sort the dust out. I asked him if the clock was ticking on my end legally. He told me no, that the property was in my name, recorded bulletproof, that the time was mine to use. The time was mine to use. I walked out of his office with that phrase echoing in my head. It was lawyer speak, referring to statutes and deadlines, but it was profoundly true in a totally different way. 3 weeks went by. Eric and I drove down to the farm on a Saturday. We packed brooms, squeegees, buckets, soap, and trash bags. We threw open the windows of the house, swept it out, busted the dust, scrubbed the sink and the stove, cranked the water main, and waited for it to run clear before using it. The shed still had some of Grandma Clara's tools hanging right where she left them. The same pruning shears I used as a kid, the metal tooth rake, 2 hoes mounted on the wall with an order she maintained right up until she couldn't. Eric washed the window panes while I swept the porch. At some point, I stopped and watched him from the yard, rag in his hand, the afternoon sun hitting his back. And I thought, Grandma Clara would have loved him. Not because he was the husband my family would have handpicked for me, but exactly for that reason. Because he was the one I picked. And for her, that was enough, and then some. Late that afternoon, we sat on the porch with 2 thick mugs of percolator coffee, made from the beans I bought at the general store. The same coffee as always. The silence of the farm at dusk was a different breed than city silence. Wider layered, just the noise of the birds overhead, and the wind cutting through the orchard, and absolutely nothing else. Eric asked me how it felt being there. I told him it felt like it was mine. Not in the sense of a deed, but in the sense of belonging. That this place belonged to me the same way the memory of Grandma Clara belonged to me. The childhood Saturdays, the 10-minute phone calls on Sunday nights. that it was an inheritance that went way beyond acreage and square footage. Eric nodded, took a sip of coffee, stared out at the orchard, and then asked if I was going to text Ryan back. I sat with that for a minute. I told him yes, I was going to reply, but I still didn't know exactly what to say, and I'd rather wait until the words were crystal clear before firing them off. Eric said that sounded right, that the answers you give when you're sure of them last a lot longer than the ones you spit out half-baked. We sat on the porch a while longer until it went pitch black. We locked the windows, deadbolted the door, snapped the padlock on the gate. We drove back to Atlanta with the radio on low, tuned to a station playing hits from 40 years ago. The kind of tracks that, no matter how many times you hear them, always hit like the very first time. That night, lying in bed with the room dark and the distant hum of the street outside, I thought about Grandma Clara, about her way of doing things without a megaphone, about how she navigated that deed transfer alone, without telling a soul, without asking anyone's permission, 4 whole years before the exact moment it was going to be needed. About how she kept the secret with the exact same piece she used to store seeds in glass jars labeled in her neat handwriting. She had planted something for me long before I knew I was going to need the shade. And she did it because she knew me, because she watched me grow up and knew exactly what I was built for. And because she also knew, with that chilling clarity old folks get when they've lived a long time and watched people even longer, that there would come a day when I would desperately need something nobody could rip out of my hands. I fell asleep thinking about that. I replied to Ryan 10 days after he texted me. Not because I was waiting for the perfect cinematic moment, but because I needed whatever I said to him to come from a baseline of total calm, not a place of reaction. I learned that from the numbers. When the bottom line makes your blood pressure spike, it means you haven't fully processed the data yet. You have to let the engine cool down to see the whole equation. I wrote it out by hand on paper first, just as an exercise for myself, to map out what I actually wanted to say before typing it into the phone. I wrote that I understood from his perspective I'd had an easier ride, that I wasn't going to debate that perception because perceptions are reality for the person holding them, even if they completely clash with the other person's truth. That what I could tell him was that I didn't get handed more opportunities. I got the exact same ones, and I scraped them off the floor myself, because nobody ever placed them directly in my palm. That it wasn't a guilt trip, just a point of clarification. That the land Grandma Clara left me wasn't going to be signed over to him, not because I didn't care that he was drowning, but because it was the absolute only thing she had left, specifically for me, with my name and her blessing, and honoring. That was the only tribute I could offer her memory. I also told him that if he ever wanted to have a real conversation, stripped of strategy and ulterior motives, the door was open. But that conversation would have to start at absolute zero, without the years of fabricated stories circulating about me and my marriage. And that required a willingness from him that I couldn't demand or expect. I could only offer the possibility of it. I sent it, just like that, without rereading it a dozen times. Things you reread too much end up dying in the edits. Ryan didn't reply, that day or the next. A week later, he sent me a short text that said, "I got your message. I need time to think about it." I told him that is fine, no rush, and I left it right there. With my dad, things were different and much slower. There was no clean moment of resolution like with Ryan. It was more like when the water level rises so slowly, you can't pinpoint the exact second the tide shifted. He called me 3 weeks after the showdown at the lawyer's office, not to talk about the farm, to ask me how I was doing. It was a short question delivered with a voice still carrying the rigid friction of a man who has zero practice asking it. I told him I was good, Working. He said he was too. There was a silence neither of us rushed to fill for a second. Then he asked if Eric was doing well. I told him yes, thank you. We hung up without much else. But something in that call was fundamentally different from anything we'd ever had before. I don't know if it was the question, or the tone, or the dead air in the middle. Whatever it was, the frequency had changed. I mentioned it to Eric that night. He told me sometimes the most tectonic shifts are the smallest ones, the ones that don't announce themselves or demand a parade. That a simple, "How are you?" from someone who never built the muscle to say it is worth 10 times more than a long speech given out of obligation. I sat with that for a while. Ryan's debt situation resolved itself, the way those things always do, when there's no trapdoor left to escape through. With time, with brutal adjustments, with liquidating assets that weren't the farm. My dad cashed out a chunk of his nest egg. The nursery guy waited longer than his original deadline, probably because in small towns, reputations outlive contracts, and my dad was still Arthur Miller. And that name still bought a little grace. Ryan moved to work with a brother-in-law up in Charlotte, at a building supply company he didn't own, which mathematically gave it a much higher chance of actually surviving. I found all this out through Lucy, who kept acting as my most reliable broadcast from Oak Haven. I never asked her to. She just told me because she felt it was her duty. I always thanked her. She's the kind of person you don't realize is a lifeline until you're already holding the rope. In April, 2 months after the notary meeting, Eric and I went down to the farm for the weekend and hired a local kid, the son of the woman from the general store, to help us revive the orchard. His name was Bobby. He was 16 and knew more about botany than you'd ever expect because his granddad used to farm and had been drilling it into his head since he could walk. I explained what we had and what needed doing. He walked through the orchard, eyeing the trees with that surgical practicality of a guy who can read a tree's vitals just by looking at the bark. He told me the fruit trees had good roots, that with a hard prune and deep watering, they could bounce back in one season. He said the lemon tree in the back was the oldest and the healthiest of the bunch. I told him, yeah, that lemon tree had some history. He nodded like that was a perfectly acceptable scientific metric and went to grab the pruning shears from the shed. Eric painted the front gate that weekend. Green. The exact same faded green as always, because there was 0 point in changing a piece of the property's soul. I scrubbed the porch, dusted the furniture, lined up the ceramic mugs in the kitchen hutch, right where Grandma Clara always kept them. On Sunday afternoon, while Bobby was finishing up the last row of trees and Eric was sanding down the edges of the gate, I was in the kitchen brewing coffee with the beans from the store. I was listening to a radio we brought down, tuned to a local station out of Macon, playing a completely random mix of tracks without much logic but with good intentions. A song came on. A song Grandma Clara used to hum under her breath without realizing it when she was deep in thought. I don't know the title. I just know the melody hit me, and I had to lean hard against the kitchen sink while I waited for the coffee to finish dripping. That was the cry that hadn't fully broken loose over the last few months. It wasn't the kind of crying that shatters you, or the kind that violently purges you. It was the kind that hits when you finally have solid ground under your boots and your body decides it's officially safe to drop the anvil you've been hauling around. The kind of cry that doesn't ask for permission or announce its arrival. It just kicks the door in, does its job, and leaves. I wiped my face with the dish towel I was holding. I poured the coffee into 2 mugs. I walked out to the porch. Eric looked at me from the gate. He didn't ask. He just grabbed his mug and sat down next to me. We sat there for a long time, watching the orchard, while Bobby wrapped up in the back. The trees already looked different, stripped of the dead weight. Cleaner. like they actually belonged to a place where people lived. The lemon tree in the back looked exactly the same, twisted, wide, refusing to need anyone to fix it. A few weeks later, I wrote a letter to my dad. By hand, on paper, with the exact same pen I used to draft the text to Ryan. It wasn't a long letter. It wasn't the time for an epic. I told him I wasn't selling the property, that it was Grandma Clara's final will, and I was going to honor it. I told him his 1/3 share was still absolutely his, and if he ever wanted to do something with his chunk of the dirt, we could talk about it. That I wasn't stonewalling a conversation, I was just stonewalling being bullied. I also told him I understood he did what he thought was right by Ryan, and it wasn't my place to play judge and jury on that. But what was my place was telling him that if he wanted a relationship with me moving forward, the foundation had to be poured completely differently. No more rumors. No more pushing the narrative of the unstable, manipulated, difficult daughter. That I didn't need a formal groveling apology. I just needed it to stop. I closed the letter by telling him the door wasn't locked. It was open. But it only opens from the inside, and they were the ones who had to turn the knob. I dropped it in the mailbox without making a copy. I already knew what it said. My dad didn't write back that week or the next. A month later, a small envelope showed up with his handwriting on the front. The script was smaller than I remembered, like the years had tightened his grip on the pen. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded in thirds. It didn't say much. That he had read my letter several times. That he had no defense against most of what was in it, because most of it was true. That his mother had always known things he was completely blind to until it was too late. That he didn't know if we could glue back together what had been smashed, but he didn't want to hit the end of his life without having tried. He didn't sign it Dad. He signed it Arthur. I don't know exactly what the hell that means. Maybe nothing. Maybe it's just his default signature for serious paperwork. Or maybe it was the only way he could stomach writing to me without buckling under the sheer weight of what that title actually means between us. I left it alone. I didn't overanalyze it. Some things are better left unexamined until they've had more time to breathe. I replied with a small index card, just a single line. Got your letter. Thanks for sending it. We'll see. And I left it right there. Time did what time does, moving forward with that brutal indifference it has toward human drama. Months passed. The firm expanded a little more. We landed another whale of a client. The junior accountant we hired proved she was even sharper than we originally thought. Eric started an online literature course at night, something he'd been talking about doing for years, and finally gave himself permission to tackle. We were heading down to the farm 2 or 3 times a month. Bobby kept coming by on weekdays to babysit the orchard. The fruit trees bounced back faster than Bobby had originally mapped out. By summer, it actually looked like a working orchard again, with heavy branches on the early bloomers. The lemon tree in the back, as expected, stayed entirely unbothered. It didn't need a comeback because it had never stopped thriving in the first place. One afternoon in July, I was sitting on the porch of the farm with a coffee and the monthly ledgers loaded on my tablet, doing what I always do when I catch a quiet moment, running the numbers in peace. The late afternoon sun was cutting through the gap between the roof and the wall in a very specific way, throwing a hard blade of light across the concrete floor that Grandma Clara painted red every 2 years with a clockwork precision I never questioned, but always recognized as a deeply personal act of care. I put the tablet down. I just stared at that blade of light. I thought about everything that had gone down since that white envelope from the law firm showed up. I thought about the standoff in the conference room and the laugh I never planned. I thought about my dad, with his hands anchored to the desk and the letter signed Arthur. I thought about Ryan and his short text saying he needed time. I thought about my mom, who still hadn't called and might not call for a very long time, and how that was okay too. Or at least it was what it was, and you build your house with the bricks you have. And I thought about Grandma Clara. Like always, like I do every single time I sit on this porch. I thought about that afternoon in her kitchen when she told me she had already arranged everything. Her calm voice dropping that bomb while peeling apples like securing a girl's entire future before checking out was the most mundane chore on her list. I thought about how she didn't tell me just so I'd have a useful piece of data. She told me so I would know something infinitely more vital, that someone had seen me clearly enough to prep the battlefield 4 years before I even knew I was going to war. She didn't just leave me a deed to a property. She left me hard, undeniable proof that a version of my story existed that didn't rely on the toxic fiction other people had written about me. You can't put a notary stamp on that. You can't file it in a county clerk's office. But it is the most valuable asset I ever inherited. So here I am, a Tuesday in July, sitting in a wicker chair on the porch of the Hopewell farm, coffee in hand, the sound of the orchard humming in the background. A streak of light on the red concrete floor, and Eric inside, reading in the hammock we strung up between the beams in the big room. Last month. I'm 37 years old. I'm a CPA. I am the legal owner of 2/3 of 10 acres of dirt in Oak Haven, Georgia, complete with a farmhouse, a tool shed, and a fruit orchard that's finally bearing fruit again. And I am the granddaughter of Clara Miller, the smallest and most colossal human being I have ever known. A woman who didn't need to raise her voice to alter the entire trajectory of a life, who planted seeds with terrifying patience, knowing roots take their sweet time, but they hold fast, and who left me a legal document screaming what words could never say clearly enough, that I was worth it, that I was worth protecting, that I was worth playing a 4-year-long game to guarantee nobody could ever rip away what was rightfully mine. This story isn't about winning a piece of real estate. It's about discovering that someone already fought and won the bloodiest battle for you long before you even realized you were standing on the front lines. It's about being seen, about having someone in your life look at you with enough clarity to truly know you, and then actually do something with that knowledge. Quietly, without a megaphone, without demanding a round of applause. Grandma Clara did that. And I'm going to spend the rest of my damn life being worthy of it. If you made it this far, thank you, truly. These stories wouldn't exist without you guys listening. If anything I just told resonated with you, let me know down in the comments. I love reading every single one of them. And if you're not subscribed to the channel yet, now's the perfect time. I'll see you in the next story.